Good afternoon, or to those of you in the UK, good evening. And my name is Dan Fesperman. I'm a writer in the US. My most recent novel is called Winter Work. It's a spy novel set in Berlin back toward the end of the Cold War. And today, however, it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Mick Herron. Mick is, he's written 16 novels, I think, 5 novellas, a slew of short stories, and his new novel is called The Secret Hours, and I say, and I don't say this lightly, I think it's his best work yet. So if you haven't got a copy, please do. Mick is one of those writers who, as soon as his book is out, and this is a very select list, as soon as his book's out, I have to have a copy. I savor it a great deal, but I usually end up reading it way too fast anyway. Anyway, with that said, good to see you, Mick, and welcome.
And you too, Dan. Thank you very much for those kind words.
Yeah, easy to say. I'd like to talk. The Secret Hours is a standalone. It's not in the Slow Horses series, which, by the way, the season 3 of the great TV adaptation, I believe that opens December 1st.
I think so. Yes.
Yeah. So that's something to look forward to as well. But this book, I'd like to talk about there's how you came to write it. I know that's often not an easy question to answer, but I just had the impression in reading it that a lot of the aspects of this book may have been percolating in your head for quite a while.
I like to give that impression, but in fact, it didn't really happen that way at all. Yeah. I started out very much with the first sentence. It was something that my brother David, who lives in Devon, where that opening chapter is set, he said to me as we were walking down the green lanes in Devon one day, he said that the worst smell in the world was dead badger. And I thought, well, I'm having that. That's a great opening line. So that's where I kicked off. And I kicked off, the opening chapter is about, as you know, is about a man who's woken up in his cottage in North Devon in the middle of the night by unknown assailants. And he ends up running for his life down those same green lanes. And the reader knows right from the start that this man is not who he says he is, that he's a former spy of some sort. And but he's been 20 years or more retired. So whatever is happening to him now, in the here and now, obviously has its roots in who he used to be 20 years ago. And when I started the book, that's what it was going to be about. It was simply going to be about this man, Max, that's his cover name. And I'd be exploring who he was. I didn't have any clear idea who he was and what he'd been up to and why these things were happening to him now. But as I explored various possibilities, I realized that I could use his history to cast a little light onto the prehistory, as it's been called, of Slough House itself. So although this isn't a Slough House novel, it's very much set in the same world, and there are 1 or 2 familiar characters who make appearance, some of them under the names that readers will be familiar with, and some of them under other names.
Yeah, in fact, it was. I thought it was a very neat trick, very well done, of the way you did mention several of the prominent characters without ever mentioning a couple of them, even by name at all.
It became a kind of running joke for me. I mean, yeah. Once that, I don't know whether you have similar things when you're writing. Once that kind of idea occurs to you, you can write a novel without actually mentioning a particular character by their name, or always. Yeah. Hiding, the gender of a particular character, it becomes irresistible, and you go to any lengths in order to preserve that.
Yeah. Although they're so distinctive that any readers who are familiar with them will probably recognize them right away by the way they talk, the way they act.
I wanted it to be a gift for regular readers, really.
Yeah.
I mean, it's lovely to recognize familiar characters without being told. You feel like you're in the know somehow when that happens.
Yeah, it quite is. Now, why the Berlin storyline? This book is set in present-day London, as you said. It's also set, part of it, a great deal of it as well, in Berlin just after the wall has come down, and which happened in 1989, so quite a while ago. I was wondering, yet you don't get to Berlin till almost halfway through the book. And I was wondering if you went back and forth at all on, well, I need to move this forward, if it was structuring, although you seem to be a very organic writer. And I was just wondering if you were, as you were going along, all of a sudden you sort of realized, okay, this is the spot. This is where I detour back into the past?
Well, it was established really by the demands of the storyline, because the flashback sequences, the sequences set in Berlin in the early 90s, are determined by the contents of the file.
Yeah.
Now, after the Max chapter, we moved to London, where a committee of inquiry has been set up to look into misdeeds of the intelligence service, going way back into the past. But they've been completely stymied by a very wily leader of the intelligence service, who has ensured that the people running this inquiry don't have access to any important documents, never get to see any classified files. So they spend several years, which I don't document in great detail, running this inquiry without getting anywhere at all, without having any leads to follow, without having any real information. And then a file falls into their hands, and they decide to risk their own careers and follow it up and investigate what really happened. So it's only at that moment, when the file is in their possession, that the readers can be allowed to see what was going on in that file, and that's when the flashback starts. So yes, it's very much towards the end of the novel. It's probably halfway or so through the book before we go back into the past. But I mean, the seeds have been sown before we get to that point. I think the readers are probably expecting to find out what's going on in that file long before we actually open it, as it were.
Yeah. It's obvious from your writing that you have a great deal of respect for the efficiency and effectiveness of the British bureaucracy, especially currently.
Yes, indeed. Writing about bureaucracy and its failures, its discontents, is very much become part of the Slough House series. So I always have a great deal of fun with it. You can write, I think, entertainingly about things that aren't necessarily in themselves entertaining. Red tape is an awful thing to struggle through, but it's quite an easy thing to make fun of and to satirize in a novel.
Now, you mentioned failure there, and that's a theme with a lot of your characters, especially the Slough House characters, but with the bureaucracy as well. And you've said in interviews, there was a poem you mentioned in a recent interview, sort of on somewhat to do with dealing with failure. And I was wondering if you could recall that line, or it's
is this the verse that I wrote when I was asked to quote lines that meant something to me? Yes, it's the final line of a poem by the Irish writer Derek Mann, and the poem is called Leaves, and the last stanza, I hope I quote it correctly, goes, "Somewhere in the heaven of lost futures, the lives we might have led have found their own fulfillment." And that's the kind of sentiment that a lot of my characters are living through. I think they're aware that their lives have been thwarted and their careers have been frustrated, but there's always, for them, the possibility, there's the possibility of redemption. They really do want that. For me, I'm more thinking along the lines of, if they weren't, they might be living bad lives now, but somewhere, if they made different decisions at different times of their lives, then perhaps they wouldn't be where they are now, and there would be fulfillment, but it's forever out of their reach.
Yeah.
It's not a very happy way of looking at it.
No, but it's comfort, I think, as writers, we deal, as writers, no matter how successful we are or aren't, we deal with a lot of failure, and it's a subject that probably is close to all of us. We've all experienced, failure. So
indeed, yes, and a lot of it, thankfully, never reaches our readers. It's all the pages we throw away. It's the paragraphs we delete. They're the ones that we're glad never see the light of day. So we can kill our darlings and make sure that our failures are buried, or at least some of them. Some of them inevitably.
We hope. But,
yes.
If our editors are any good and doing us a service.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, your writing is very it's very rhythmic. It really sounds nice when read aloud. And so I wasn't surprised to also read that originally, before you were a novelist, you were a poet. You can see those rhythms and hear those rhythms in your prose. But tell me a little about that, how you evolved into a novelist from a poet.
Well, it was when poetry stopped happening for me. I wrote verse when I was early 20s, really, is when I was writing it. And then it just kind of stopped happening. It dried up. It's the only real instance of writer's block that I've ever suffered. I know what that is like, and it was less dramatic for me in a way, because it's not like I was earning my living writing these poems. But it stopped happening for me, and it was quite frustrating experience, because I didn't lose the creative urge. I just lost the ability to express it. So I changed direction and thought, well, I'll have to write something. So I started working on a novel. But I found that all the things that I learned about writing verse, which is all about the weight of words, the syllabic weight of words, and rhythm, and the importance of avoiding repetition and that kind of thing, all became very much the same tools that I was going to be using in writing prose. And I remain very, very glad that I had that the apprenticeship, if you like, of writing verse. Because it's something that I still use every day, even though I'm not using it to actually write poems.
No. Yeah. Do you find yourself as a reader gravitating to writers who have sort of a poetic rhythm to their language as well, and all of that?
I think probably. I mean, I admire writers whose prose sings to me. Mm-hmm. At the same time, there are times when I think we all have times when we just want to read something really kinetic. You want to pick up a book that just pushes you through and then piles on right to the last page that you can't put down. And there won't necessarily be any sentences you can remember. You can't quote from it afterwards, but you enjoy the rush.
And sometimes you can get both. You can get the kinetic pace, and you can still get the poetic language. When both of those click, it's really
so. A writer like James Lee Burke in his prime, in the early days, when I first came across James Lee Burke, there was that. He had both those things there, and I love that. And there are plenty of writers around who still do it. There are a number of writers around who are poets when they're not writing thrillers. James Hall is one that comes to mind.
Robert Penn Warren was one of my favorites when I was in college, and he was a poet first, and perhaps to some still better known as a poet. But Now, going back to the Slow Horses universe, when you first came up with that cast of misfits, how much attention, and I know this happens with writers when you're developing a character, you often plot out their backstory, their personal history, just so you'll have a better feel for them, what motivates them, what their anxieties are, what they dislike. How deeply did you do that at that time? And I guess the other danger of that is if you ever decide to go back into their past, or as you had done with some of them in this book, if you reveal too much of that early on, you risk painting yourself into a corner about what you can do with them in their past later. I was just wondering how deeply you went into their character in that first novel, because I guess when you wrote that first novel, you did not yet envision it as a series.
I didn't on a conscious level, but looking back on it now, when I introduced the characters, the individual slow horses at the beginning of the book, I probably spent a lot more time on them than would have been necessary if I was simply going to use them for a single book. So I think part of me felt that I was working up a world that I was going to be hanging around in for a bit longer than just a single novel. But that wasn't my express intention. I mean, I thought that it was a one-off that I was writing, that it was a standalone. And I did obviously think quite hard about the individual characters, but I didn't go too far back into their past, only as much as I wanted them to do so. So when they're contemplating their miserable existences, there had to be a certain amount of detail, expressing how that misery came about. And obviously there had to be reasons for them being in Slough House. So there's a certain amount of backstory there for almost all of them. Some of the characters I didn't reveal why they were there. Largely because I thought it was funnier not to. But since then, I found that I frequently have to, in between books, have to go back and read the earlier ones just to remind myself from what I said about characters, and draw on the details and the hints that I sowed in earlier books. I agree that it can be a potential hazard. You might be pinning yourself down too much in writing a series, in accidentally writing a series. But there are also moments where it can help, because when you go back and scavenge around and find the odd detail, it looks like you have a plan, and it looks like you're being really clever and drawing on, a long drawn out backstory, whereas in fact you're mostly doing it off the cuff. I mean, that's how I've been doing it.
That's good. And it does help, like if you know all of their motivations and what's behind everything, that makes it easier to advance them and push them forward.
Always, whether you're writing a series or a standalone, then you have to really understand. You don't necessarily have to know the full history of the characters, but you have to know what's making them tick. You have to know what they're thinking about, what they're feeling. Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned having to look up a detail every now and then. Have you ever had that unnerving experience of encountering a reader who probably knows more about some of your characters than you do, and they mention a detail that you can't quite remember yourself?
Yes, yes. So many details are just throwaway, aren't they? I mean, you put something in because it feels right at the time, and then you get you brought to your attention several years later, and you've got no memory of writing it. Yes,
I will sometimes look at books I wrote years ago, and someone will bring them up, and I'll feel like I've just gone to a family reunion. And I'm trying to remember the names of all these uncles I haven't seen in years.
Yeah. And, but it's flattering. It's flattering the readers do it.
Yeah, it is. It is. But there I want to hear a little bit more about you go to a flat to write. You don't write in your home. Is that where you are now, or are you at home now? Is this
I'm at home now, although this is in fact a studio in the garden. It's not where I work. It's where my partner works. There's a her books behind me now. I have an apartment, which is where I lived for many years, and now I live with my partner in a house not very far away from that apartment. And I go there most days. Yeah, I'm there 9 till 5. He said 8 till 4, and that's where I do the work. Yeah. And it's got all my books in. It's got all my music. It's where I feel comfortable.
Good. And you can write, and you're one of the people who can write with music, I take it. So.
Oh yeah, yes, but it's I can't write to music with words, or not words that I understand. I can listen to chord music, but mostly I listen to instrumental stuff, jazz. And I don't like other people's words bouncing around my head when I'm trying to come up with.
Definitely. And don't ever write with Gregorian chants. You'll start writing in Latin. So. Now, I think many people are amazed. I know I'm amazed when I hear that basically not just no social media, but you're really, except for maybe cases like this, you're really not on the internet. Is that correct? You just...
Well, I am when I'm back at home, but I'm not at the apartment. No, there's no Wi-Fi there.
No distractions.
No distractions. I mean, I found the internet extraordinarily distracting. It, I end up checking email every 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Check the headlines every 2 minutes.
Yeah, exactly.
And research. I mean, I'm not great at research at the best of times, but anytime I do want to look something up, I find myself going down a rabbit hole very, very quickly, and that can swallow a morning. So I avoid doing any of that. I would prefer, when I'm procrastinating, I prefer to be, having a nap or reading a book rather than chasing around the internet. So
yeah. How did you steep yourself in 1989, 1990 era Berlin? How did you go about doing that?
I did research that, obviously, but because although I've been to Berlin a few times, it's not a city I know well, and I'd never been to it for the period that I was writing about. So I read, but what I'm mostly reading was sort of social history. It wasn't. I didn't over concern myself with geographical detail. I mostly wanted to know what kind of people were there, what the social life was like, what the city tasted like, what it smelled like, how young it was. I mean, this is the thing that mostly struck me. It was a very young person's city then.
Very much, yeah.
And the kind of hedonism that had descended on the city. There was partly a huge celebration with the unification of Germany, and also a massive hangover as well, which seemed to be going on simultaneously. So I enjoyed playing around with those aspects of it, and a lot of it is speculation. My normal approach to this is, if that was me there at that time, what would I feel about it? And trying to invest that sort of thing in my characters and have them feeling that way.
Yeah. And Berlin was very much an island that up until 1989 as well, and people there felt, especially West Berlin, really, they felt very isolated, and that's why, you mentioned all of the youth there. You dodged the German army conscription there.
Well, this was why it was a city so full of young men at the time. It was like Canada of Europe.
And as you called it, the spook zoo. It was the place where all the spies went to spy on each other.
This is it. I mean, as you well know, it's long been the kind of mecca, I suppose, of espionage writers. It's where it all happened. It's where everything was focused on for so long. And even now, when I visit Berlin, it still has that feel about it. It's that kind of visceral excitement, which is still there, despite the fact that it's more than 30 years in the past now.
One last question about the secret hours before we move to some questions of some of the viewers. There was a very, very minor character, but she was a spy novelist you mentioned briefly, Deborah Ford Lodge, who, like many, yourself included, have been mentioned as the heir to Le Carré, one of an admittedly long list, as you said. And she had written a series of 10 novels about a mole hunt. I enjoyed you playing with that there, but I was wondering how much fun you had in just inserting that at all. And also the idea that they would see her as an expert on espionage, even though all she did was write fiction. So.
Well, it often seems to me that writers of fiction are taken far more seriously than perhaps we deserve to be, because we are, after all, making it. I'm more than most people. I'm making it up. I'm not an expert in any sense. So that was fun, but also I had to go out of my way to make sure that it couldn't be. None of the things I was saying could be applied to any friends of mine. I know a lot of spy novelists. I wasn't talking about any of them. I was inventing somebody. I had to be very careful about that.
Yes. Well, that makes a nice segue into our first question from our viewers, which is, have you received, and this is from Jean Rotondo, and she asked, have you received any advice from MI5 or MI6?
No, I've never had any direct contact with any serving members of the intelligence services
that you know of.
That I know of, yes. I mean,
yes.
The whole point is these people are secret agents. They don't tell you when they're.
Yeah, that fellow who was repairing the plaster last week was actually MI5. So
that's right. But I have talked to a couple of people who used to work for the intelligence service, and these have always been very brief social encounters. Sometimes at readings, people have approached me after public events of one sort or another and said, I used to work for MI5 and whatever. And I can't ever say, well, prove it. I mean, they could be anybody. But I did talk not that long ago with somebody who genuinely was a former chief security advisor to the British government, and I had a most interesting conversation with him over the dinner table about 6 months ago. It was, yes. And there was some interesting stuff come out of that conversation. Some of which, I'm twisting it a bit, but it will be used.
I've had the same thing at readings and whatnot. Ex-spies will come up and they'll tell me little stories, which I'll end up using. And I've found that when I interview them for research, they're much more open with me or with you because they know they're not going to be quoted by name. They know it's not going into a newspaper or on television as fact. It will be disguised as fiction, which I think was how a lot of ex-spies, when they wrote novels, they approached it the same way. They felt like, all right, these are secrets, but I'm disguising them. So it's okay. So anyway.
This is why so many espionage writers, I'm sure you get it all the time, are assumed to have been former spies themselves.
Yeah. This question is from David Brown, and he says, how do you feel about the adaptations of your books on Apple TV? Do you wish they had done anything differently?
No, I'm absolutely delighted with what they've done. I wouldn't change a thing. What I found extraordinary is the lengths that they've gone to reproduce what's in the books. They're very, very faithful. Not just to the plot. I don't mind if the plot gets changed. The plot has to get changed. In order to put it on screen. The narrative of storytelling, the grammar of the storytelling is much different on screen than it is on the page. But what they've done is they've got the characters. They've really nailed them and the mood and the tone of the books, and that's what's important to me. And it's quite extraordinary to me to see the lengths they went to do that. When you're watching the show, when you see the outside of Slough House, that's actually the building that I decided was Slough House. I used to walk past it twice a day on my way to and from my office at work when I was working in London. I'd get off the tube and I'd walk past this building, and that's at one point nearly 20 years ago, I thought I'm going to use that building. And that's the building that they show. And they didn't have to do that, but they got permission to use it. And simply to go that extra mile to provide the authenticity. So there's all sorts of moments like that in the TV show where they didn't need to stick as close to the text as they did. And it's immensely gratifying to see it. But the cast are just tremendous. When you've got Gary Oldman, Saskia Reeves, Christian Scott Thomas, and Jack Lowden, and all the others. they're just amazing to watch. So
They
yeah,
really are. I was so impressed by the casting for that. I just feel like they got the characters dead on. So it's just,
well, for me, I felt that if they get the characters right, then everything will be okay,
yeah,
and they did that. That's very much the approach that they took.
yeah. Next question from Bala Chandrasekaran, and she asks, "Will we experience the joy of more Slow House adventures?"
I hope so. I'm writing one at the moment.
Oh, good.
I'm not very far into it. I'm just picking up speed, I hope. But I'm glad to be back with them. I'm glad to be back with the Slow Horses. I think that they're my crew. They're where I feel happiest these days. So yes, I'll be working on that just as soon as I'm off this interview. I won't really. It's quite late here.
Well, everyone would probably say, "Well, get to it right now, then." But this question is from Laurie Johnson. How do you pace yourself while writing a new novel? What does your writing schedule typically look like? And I think you mentioned about 8 to 4, but
more like 10 to them. I try to write every day, and I'm no longer time poor in the way that I was when I was working for a living.
Yeah.
I mean, I had an actual day job where I was very time poor, and I set myself 350 words. I had about an hour and a quarter, an hour and a half of energy left at the end of the day when I was doing my writing, and that was my target. Now I have most of the day in which to write, and I don't set myself targets like that, but I do like to see a certain amount of progress. I like to get a page or so done. It starts slowly. I mean, I started work on the book that I'm writing now in April. I mean, that's when the date in my notebook the new book first appears. But it was a couple of months before I actually started putting prose down on the screen, and that wasn't page one. I write little bits here and there, snippets of dialogue, descriptions of new characters, locations and things. And then after a while of that, once I've avoided it for as long as possible, I start writing at page one. And at that point, I just try and keep on writing sequentially. That doesn't always work. I mean, I do feel that if there's a bit that I really want to write, then I'll just write it. I think it's wrong to punish myself by withholding that. If I'm in the mood for writing something, then it's going to come out better than it would otherwise. But it picks up speed after a while. But the best I can do is 800, 900 words in a day.
Yeah.
That's a good day for me. Yeah, but I rewrite all the time. I mean, I was
going to say
every 10,000 words or so, I go back to the beginning and go through it, and the book gets shorter and shorter all the time. Every time I do that.
Yeah.
So it's
every time I go back through my beginnings, I by the end of the book, I've probably done them over about 30 times at the beginning.
We sound like we're right. Yeah, we have the same kind of approach by the sound of it. Yeah. Rewriting is the far more important part than writing.
It is.
I think.
It is,
yeah.
Which
anybody can put words down on the page.
Which seems to be the hardest part to convey to people who want to start out too. I think they're always shocked when you say you need to rework this. It's like it's not perfect the first time. And
well, I remember it took me a while to realize that that's what needed doing. That the rewriting is far more important than the writing. But I think that's partly when I talk to people who are just starting out and they say things like, "Oh, I can't bear looking over what I've written." And I think, well, that's your subconscious telling you that it's not actually very good yet. Exactly. Once you get to the point where you realize that and that you are able to go back, that's when you start getting better as a writer. Once you realize that you have to take a step back and see what you've written as if somebody else had written it, then you can alter it, then you can change it, then you don't care about deleting stuff anymore. When you're brand new to it and it's very important to you, you've just written 1,000 words. You don't want to take any of those words out because it feels like going backwards. Yeah. But that's the big learning step. Once you've done that, that's the quantum leap into really starting to approach it as a grown-up writer rather than a beginner.
As you get deeper into a book, do you find that it takes over your mind and occupies you more deeply as you go along, to the point that sometimes you're waking up at 3 a.m. and saying, all right, that's the line I was looking for. This is the dialogue I need. This is the transition I wanted. And you have to rush and write it down then. Or if you wait till you wake up, it'll all be gone.
It'll go. Yeah, it's a slow dive, isn't it? Once you get to the point, and I'm about reaching that with the new book now, when I wake up and I'm thinking about it, or when I'm going to bed.
Yeah.
in the evening, looking forward to the following day's work. I mean, that's when I know that the book is actually up and running and that it's going to happen and that it will all be at least done in the long run, that I will get there.
Yeah.
Initially, there's a lot of dancing around and shying away from it, and you work for a bit during the day, and then you're glad to see the back of it.
Yeah.
That's when you're just sort of getting to know the book. But once you're really launched into it, yes, it becomes an obsession. It becomes all encompassing, and it's a good feeling. I mean, you know that you're writing the right book apart from anything else. Once you've reached that, once you've got that relationship with it, you know that you're writing the book that you ought to be writing.
Especially since by the time it's published, you've probably read the whole manuscript at least 6 or 7, probably more times. And if it still holds up by that time, then you know you've done a pretty good job.
I think the part where I start to hate it is after I've done all the editorial stuff. Once the proofreaders changes start coming in, at that point, I just don't want to see this anymore. I don't care.
Yeah, exactly.
And that goes on for months afterwards before you can bear to look at it again. Yeah, there's very much a love-hate swing goes on.
We have a question from Helen Nixon, who wants to know: do you know how a book is going to end before you start it?
Almost always. Not always, but almost always. Knowing how it's going to end for me feels like that's the destination. I don't always know how I'm going to get there, but I generally know that that's where I want to be when I finish. And I'll generally have a few way stations along the way that I know I'm going to hit, bells that you have to ring here and there. But the bits in between those, the big wide spaces in between those way stations, that's what happens on a day-to-day basis. That's the organic growth of the book. I find that out when I'm actually doing the work.
Yeah, exactly.
I
told somebody once that I always know A and Z in the alphabet when I start, and maybe about 5 or 6 letters in between, but all the other letters I have yet to figure out. So
that's a nice way of putting it. Thank you. I like
that. 4 questions from Gina Ritchie, Kathy Hargrove, Karen DeBraccio, and Jane Goldberg, and they're all kind of related, so I'll sort of string them all together. When did your love for reading begin? What books did you read as a child? What author influenced you as a child? And who inspired you as a writer?
I think, like most writers, I'm sure it's true of you, I've been a reader I can't remember not being a reader. It's just part of my human experience. Now, I learned to read very young. My mother was a primary school teacher, and she taught me to read before I was being schooled. And stories were just what I did. They're where I took refuge from. I didn't need refuge. It's not like I had an endangered childhood or anything. But I was always a story reader and wanted to be in these places where fantastical events were taking place. And so I read everything I could get my hands on. Now, for a British child of that generation, for me, as for so many others, it was Enid Blyton, who was my way into stories. And she recognized the importance of narrative, that for a narrative addict, which she wanted her readers to be, you just had to keep producing story all the time. There had to be more. Didn't matter about the quality, it was the quantity that counted. So I read everything I could lay my hands on. I read most of what she was writing, all sorts of other children's stories. Many of them I wouldn't remember the authors now. A lot of sort of children's classics. I mean, by which I mean both things like The Wind in the Willows and that sort of book, but also children's versions of classic stories. There was a wonderful book of Tales of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, which I remember devouring, and it was not entirely child friendly. I mean, it was a violent version. A lot of the knights die, and there was no sort of glossing over the relationships that went on. The Lancelot's adultery with Guinevere and that sort of thing. They were all there, but that kind of thing I read. Branch into adult fiction for me, as again for many other people of my generation, was Agatha Christie.
Yeah.
But again, I was reading everything I could lay my hands on. I was a great library user and still am, and so there was an infinite amount of choice, it felt like. And I was reading books that wouldn't have been available to me at school or at home. So not there was anything wrong with them, anything dubious about them. It's just that I read so much that these books weren't always there. So I was reading writers like Muriel Spark and John O'Hara, the great American short story writer. The American writers I particularly got into at that time were the great triumvirate of Steinbeck, Fitzgerald, and Hemingway.
Yeah.
And Steinbeck, I still think, was the most important of those three. His books, particularly the comedies that he wrote, I loved Cannery Row and Sweet Thursday.
Oh yeah, wonderful book.
Or only comedies, wonderful books.
I still want to try a beer milkshake someday.
Oh, yeah, yes. Or grow a beard.
Yes.
And for me, there's a page in Sweet Thursday, which for me is the gold standard of dialogue. It has a whole bunch of people all talking at once. It's very, very funny. It moves the plot along, and it's all done through dialogue. And that's I love writing scenes of group dialogue, and that's what I'm thinking of as the standard for writing such scenes. In terms of actual inspiration, it's hard to say because as a writer, as you'll know, the whole aim is to find your own voice, and
yes.
We all know that we're borrowing from other writers in a way, but we try to get rid of all traces of those borrowings when we're actually doing the writing, and we hope that there's no overt influence there. Obviously there is going to be, but it's something that our readers will notice rather than we ourselves most of the time. If I notice that I'm more or less copying somebody or aping somebody's tone in writing something, I would generally get rid of it. But I do also feel that when you're young, and I'm thinking of sort of late teens, early 20s, when you're doing all that reading, those are the books that really enter your heart, and
that's true.
They stick with you. And I think of it as having had a well, and I filled my well during those years, as we all do, with everything I could, all the writers that I read, good, bad, indifferent, and that's the well I've been going back to ever since to draw on for my own writing. And it's such a melange of different voices now. I wouldn't know half of them, I wouldn't recognize them anymore. But they're all influences there, one way or the other.
Can you think of a particular novel you might have read where you had this realization? I don't know if it would have been in adolescence or when, where you're thinking, all right, this is an adult book. And I don't mean that in a censored way. I just mean like I've moved down to something higher, to some higher ground here. And this is the kind of book I'm going to look for from now on. And it really inspired you in that way as a reader more than as a writer.
I think it would probably be To Kill a Mockingbird, which I must have read when I was about 13, 14. Yeah. And that was, it wasn't the first adult book I read, but it was the first one where perhaps where I felt that fiction was doing something. It had important things to say that could affect the way you live your life, rather than just being, a commentary on adult subjects like, politics or murder or something like that. So probably To Kill a Mockingbird, I'd say.
Yeah, but you mentioned Agatha Christie. When did you begin to get deeply into genre fiction, and how did you decide that was where you wanted to start writing fiction?
I mentioned earlier about the joys of kinetic fiction. I mean, not all crime fiction, not all thriller fiction is, but a lot of what I was reading at that time was, the thrillers of the 70s, what appealed to me when I came to write, that I felt that I wanted to write within the genre, was the structures that were offered there. Principally, an ending. I mean, again, as we've touched on, the fact that these books like this have to have an ending. You have to have the resolution there, which makes it essentially, it provides you with scaffolding, or at least you're aware that you have to have the scaffolding there. And I think without that scaffolding, without the knowledge that I was writing something to a specific structure, which had to have a beginning, a middle, and an end in which everything that happens in the beginning and the middle is sort of resolved one way or another, that made the task much more clearly defined than if I'd simply sat down to write, I'm going to write about a bunch of people who are, I don't know, young people in the 1980s, and this is what their lives are like. I'd still be writing that book now, I wouldn't have known how to end it. I wouldn't have known what structure to impose upon it. I wouldn't have known how to tell a story without having that template there, if you like, the scaffolding. So it just seemed to me that was necessary. That was the way I wanted to go. I don't think we have that much choice about the books we write, really. I love Stephen King's answer when he was asked why he wrote horror fiction rather than anything else, and he responded by saying, "Why do you imagine I have a choice?" these are the books that are just given to him to write, and I think we all, at some level or other, are dealing with that. These are the books I know I can write. This is what I can do.
Yeah.
This is where my best work will lie, and that's what I've been doing.
How big of a hurdle was with your first book in particular, with just thinking you were going to be able to finish it, or was that never an issue with you? I know because with a lot of first-time novelists, that's the thing. So
it's the advice that I give to beginners who are talking about wanting to write. I say, whatever you're doing, finish it. Even if halfway through, it's not going particularly well, and you get a better idea. You learn more from finishing a book than you will from any other aspect of it. Because what it will teach you, apart from anything else, is that you're capable of doing this. You can finish a novel, and that is the big question that has to be answered if you're setting out to be a novelist. Simply whether you can do it or not. Once you know you can do it, then you can relax about that. And you can relax into what you do next and focus on other aspects of the book rather than simply knowing that it is, an obstacle course which has to be completed. You can do that bit. Now you can focus on, your rhythm, your strides, everything else.
Now, here's a wide-ranging question from Jessica DeLillo, no relation to Don, as far as I know. She says, what is the best advice you have ever received?
Best advice I've ever received? Oh, I don't know. Invest in a pension, probably, something like that. As far as writing advice goes, I don't know that I can boil it down to a single thing. I will say that the best book on writing that I've read is On Writing by Stephen King, as I've just mentioned. Everything he has to say about the practice of writing fiction, you pay attention to because he knows how to do it. And his advice in that book is always absolutely on the money as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. So yes, best advice would be read On Writing by Stephen King.
Question from Cheryl Klein. Do you enjoy drawing up your protagonist or your bad guy, bad girl more?
I find that whoever I happen to be writing on any given day, I can lean into wholeheartedly. I write almost always from the point of view of whoever I happen to be writing about. All my scenes are told from the point of view of one, sometimes more, of any given character. So it's important to me to be seeing everything that's going on through the eyes of that particular character at any given time. And it doesn't matter to me whether they are, the good guy, the bad guy. What matters is that I endorse it 100% because I'm telling it from their point of view. So it's their belief structures that I'm writing from, and I love doing that. I think the opportunity to adopt all these different personae is what appeals to me in the work of the novelist. You can essentially just pretend to be other people all day long, which is great fun.
Now, a question that occurred to me as well, and talking about all this and going back to the adaptation on television, I believe I read you saying recently that when someone asked whether you now think of Jackson Lamb as Gary Oldman, you basically said you never really thought of how Jackson Lamb looked. You only had a voice. You knew how he sounded. Does he now sound like Gary Oldman? And I asked because John le Carré said that basically, and thank goodness this hasn't happened with you, he said that after he saw the Alec Guinness portrayal of George Smiley, he was unable to get that voice out of his head. Dying fall of Alec Guinness. And so he thought of that from then on as Smiley's voice, and he couldn't write him anymore. And we didn't see him for years, except in bit parts. So.
I didn't know that about the Carré. That's interesting. Oh. I didn't know that had prevented him from pursuing Smiley. No, when I say voice, I'm not really thinking about how he sounds. I'm thinking about the point of view, the attitude.
Right.
It's really what he says,
like the way he speaks, and
the way he speaks, what he's saying, rather than the sound of his voice.
I see.
But I have found that in the book I'm writing now, with the scene with Lamb in it, I have found myself once or twice going through some of the dialogue using Gary's voice, and it seems like a perfectly sensible thing to do now that I have that image available to me.
Yeah, right.
So it's not what I'm thinking about when I'm writing, but it might be
Yeah,
what I think about when I read back. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And what harm can it do? Oldman is giving such a superb uh, performance as Lamb. It's so wholehearted that it can only help me, I think.
Is it fun for you to watch those shows, or is it odd hearing your own lines occasionally repeated to you? Yeah.
Well, sometimes the hearing the line, when I know it's a line of dialogue that's
Yeah, yeah.
taken straight from the book, is quite good fun. Um, I'm kind of ahead of them. They're catching up, I guess, but I'm ahead of them. So I am very much looking forward to seeing Real Tigers. I'm going to see it week after next, I think. I'll be spending
Oh,
a whole
very
day
good.
in cinema, and I'll watch all 6 episodes. And I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah.
But this is 8, 9 years since I was writing that book. So it's not like it's right on the top of my mind or anything. Like you said before, it's I'll be remembering the plot as it's happening rather than before it does. So no, it's great fun for me, and it doesn't feel as strange as it might. I mean,
Yeah.
if I were to sit down and watch a film of, I don't know, The Secret Hours tomorrow, that would probably feel strange because that's
Yeah, yeah.
still raw, it's still new, I'm still very
Right.
much, part of my head is still in that book.
Right.
But when it's there are so many books between what I'm seeing on TV and where I am now that they act as a cushion really, and
Yeah.
it does. I don't feel vulnerable when I'm watching it, particularly.
Obviously, you're not getting tired of these characters or of writing the books because they still are all very fresh, and there's nothing stale about them at all as each one comes out. I was wondering if you have any vague idea even of how many more books you think you have in this series. Obviously, we hope you have plenty more other books as well, but what?
I don't, but I'm starting to feel like I ought to. I ought to have some idea of how this will pan out.
Yeah.
So maybe I should think in those terms, but maybe not until I've finished writing this book. Maybe I'll give it some thought after
Yeah.
that. But I am starting to feel, none of us getting any younger, that I would rather, sort of finish the series than have the curtain fall on it due to, the exigencies of life, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah.
We'll see. Yeah.
What other kind? I guess. Well, remembering what you said about how you came to write The Secret Hours, do you have any ideas for other novels that you think you'll take on?
And not
Not
as
for
such, but I enjoyed writing it so much that I think more
Yeah.
in that vein is probably in the future for me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
stepping away, it's a slightly standalone territory, but probably in the same universe as I have been,
Yeah.
because I enjoyed that. I enjoyed finding new characters in different situations, and also there's a bit more freedom involved. Perhaps I don't have to worry about how these characters are going to be in the next book. I know I can do whatever I like with them in this book and then never see them again. So that might help.
Yeah. 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 Well, wonderful job. How Rachel Donovan wants to know, who is your favorite character that you've created in your book? And I assume she means The Secret Hours, and why?
I enjoyed writing about the character Alison North in
Yes.
The Secret Hours. I think perhaps she's the youngest character I've written, or at least for a while, certainly in this particular series of books.
Right.
And
she's in Berlin, and she's in Berlin in 1989. Yeah.
Yeah, in the early 90s. Yeah. I think that, yes, because she's young. Most of my characters are kind of cynical and bashed about a bit by life, and have had are bruised, shall we say, a bit bruised by stuff that they've been through. Whereas Alison, all of this lies ahead of her. She hasn't had any of that happen to her yet, so she's a bit more idealistic, perhaps. And she just seemed, fresher. I mean, she's just young. I think these are all just different ways of saying she's still young, and I find that I enjoyed writing that. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Interesting. Did she make you any more optimistic about things?
Not in the long run, no. Only in the early parts.
Not here either. So it's hard to come by these days. But if you're living in our countries, but What was this was Abina Miles, and she wants to know, what was your hardest scene to write in The Secret Hours and why?
Oh, I don't know about you, but I found it very difficult looking back on a book to remember precisely which were the really difficult bits. Um, because there are parts when you're writing a book where
Yeah,
some scenes just seem to take forever and you can't get them right. And I know that happened when writing this, but I can't for the life of me remember which particular bits it, there were. I do know that I had expected the Berlin scenes, the historical ones, to be the most challenging to write, and in fact, they were the most fun, and they came really
yeah,
quite smoothly.
yeah.
And I wrote those relatively swiftly. I was writing about 1,000 words a day when I did those passages,
Hmm.
so that surprised me. Other parts, they tend to be towards the beginning of a book, I think, when you're still not quite settled into it, and some of the characters are still new, and you're not quite sure
Yeah,
where they are or who they are. So it would have been, the earlier parts of the book, not the first chapter, because I knew clearly what was going to happen in that chapter. And I knew that I didn't have to go into any great psychological depth there because mostly it's a chase sequence. And I really enjoyed writing it, but it's one of those more kinetic pieces that we talked about.
yeah,
So that didn't count. But from then on, the earliest chapters would have been trickier to write simply because I was still finding my way into the book.
yeah,
And no matter how many times you rewrite it, to erase any uncertainties as far as the
yeah,
reader is concerned, they're still there for the writer, and you can remember
yeah.
them, sort of having been there.
You mentioned the way you like to write group dialogue, and
Mm.
which comes across great because it's always very effective. But do you ever hit these when you're hitting your stride on that? Does it ever feel almost at times like you're taking dictation and just listening in on these people, and it's just popping right
I,
up there for you?
I know why writers say that. I mean, I can recognize it. I don't quite feel it. It doesn't seem quite that automatic. But
Yeah,
there is something about writing when you're actually, when you're really feeling like you're in the zone and you know the
yeah,
characters very well that you're writing about, when it
yeah,
does start to come very, very freely. The
yeah,
danger in that is that you write too much. I mean,
yeah,
that's where the rewriting really comes in. I have to go back over
yeah.
those passages and
Go
take
back
out
and shut them
a
up
lot of
later.
lines.
Yeah,
Yeah, shut them up later, because I just get too self-indulgent in the first drafts. So yes, that does happen in a way. Yeah.
yeah. Well, thank you so much, Mick. This was great, and I'm sure everybody
Oh,
really
it's easy.
enjoyed this. And I need to remind everyone here. I wanted to let you know, the viewers, for those of you who bought a ticket that included the Secret Hours signed edition, the book will be delivered to you in about 8 to 10 business days. In addition, extra copies of the Secret Hours signed edition are available 24/7 on the Barnes & Noble and the website at barnesandnoble.com. And the Secret Hours hardcover is available at their local B&N stores. So thank you for everyone. Thank you to Aisha and to Harry for making things run smoothly here. And thank you, Mick. This was a pleasure.
Thank you, Dan. Me too. And look forward to seeing you next time I'm over there.
All
Jo
right.
asks to be remembered to you. She sends her very best.
Oh, yes. Well, give my regards to Joe. Thanks.
Will do. Will do. Thank you, Aisha. Thank you, Harry. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Goodbye now. Bye.
Bye-bye.